With the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC coming up and all the good reviews backing up Elden Ring, now seems like a good time to get into the game, right? Don't go buying it just yet, because Elden Ring might not be for you. Don't get me wrong, I finished the game more than thrice at this point and already loved From Software's games before Elden Ring even came out, but there's a few noteworthy mentions on the bad side that this game has. Of course, to those who love the Souls series, the answer to the title of this video is a no-brainer. But with the upcoming DLC and the still common thought that Souls games are way too hard, too punishing, too vague, not worth it, I made this video in hopes that people who think this way could give this great game a go. I won't just be talking about the good points. Just because it won Game of the Year doesn't mean it's perfect, and I'll be mentioning both the pros and cons of the game throughout the video. We'll be talking about the game's story, gameplay, and replay value. All this to answer the question, is Elden Ring the game for you? Now let's get on with the video. Sit back and relax, maidenless tarnished, because we're diving into the game's story. Elden Ring is set in a place called the Lands Between. It's a huge open world full of magic, soldiers, monsters, and otherworldly beings set on either feeding you to become stronger or feeding on you over and over and over again. The intro cinematic of the game is quite vague, to put it lightly. If this would be your first time getting into the Souls franchise, you'd be diving into the game without figuring out too much from the introduction. You'll learn more about the lore of the game through dialogue, item descriptions, interactable objects around the world, and even from the boss fights themselves, so don't worry if you don't have a clue what's going on. Basically, what you need to know is that there was this thing called the Elden Ring, it got shattered, the current ruler has gone missing, and a godlike being was killed. This caused said ruler's kids to fight over the shattered pieces of the Elden Ring for power, putting the Lands Between in a state of war. Now, a bunch of notable people have been brought back to life in hopes of bringing the pieces of the Elden Ring back together, reforging it, and becoming the new Elden Lord. You happen to be one of those people. It's now time for you to start your journey, a journey to the Lands Between. When you put it that way, it sounds simple enough. But once you get into it, and trust me, you will, you'll find out just how deep the rabbit hole of Elden Ring lore goes. I know a lot of people who would like to have a solid storyline to follow when playing games, but if you can give this one a chance, I promise once you figure out the whole story, or most of it at least, it won't disappoint. While everything's vague in the beginning, the game does have a mechanic which gives you directions on where to go to continue the main story. Keep a lookout for notable item descriptions, unique NPCs and their dialogue, and the cutscenes you'll encounter randomly through the game or when fighting the bosses. Alternatively, if you want to learn more about the story on a much more detailed level, you can go ahead and watch VaatiVidya's lore videos. Dude is one of the best in making those. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the story of the game, so we'll move on to its bread and butter, the gameplay. Starting off the gameplay section, we've got the controls. If you're not playing this game with a controller, then you're playing it wrong. Unless you're one of those people that can finish the game with an electric saxophone, voice command, or any other weird method that us mortals can only dream of trying. But to be honest, I don't really need to explain all that to you because the game does a good job of explaining this in its tutorial section, which can be completely skipped on purpose if you're a hardcore gamer, but you risk never being able to fight the best boss in the game, Soldier of Godric. One of the things I do want to point out though is that the shield has never found a better place in the Souls series than here. After successfully blocking an attack, you can do a counter by pressing R2 that does quite a bit of damage to both health and poise, which sets you up for easy critical attacks on your enemies. Another thing would be the Ashes of War. These are skills that cost FP that are tied to your weapon. Some weapons come with an Ash of War, but most of them can be switched up as long as the Ash of War can be used for that weapon type. What makes this feature notable is that unique weapons will most likely have unique Ashes of War. If you've heard of the infamous Rivers of Blood or the Moonveil Katana, then you know exactly how overpowered some Ashes of War can be. While the Ashes of War and the added mechanic to blocking are things that you'd easily get used to, one mechanic that's been in the series since forever and has an extremely high risk and reward is parrying. For most of us, me included, it'd be quite scary to try this, as failing to parry will most likely result in you getting your face bashed in. When mastered though, the game's combat opens up in a way that you'd see opportunities to strike during times that you'd normally just dodge. All this talk about combat and all the rumors of Souls games being unforgiving must be off-putting for the masses. Don't worry, you won't have to go through all of that alone. Introducing Spirit Ashes. Somehow the devs figured out that while this game is fun, it's quite hard to play alone sometimes. So they added summons to the game that cost FP instead of having to hope that someone has their summon sign near the boss gate or that an NPC needs to be in the boss fight to progress their quest. Of course, summon signs and unique NPCs joining the boss fight due to a quest step have been here since forever, but what makes Spirit Ashes awesome is that you can actually upgrade them and make them stronger the same way you would with weapons. These can also be swapped out so you can have different Spirit Ashes for certain encounters and playstyles. While some are unique and the community has obviously picked some as the best, the Spirit Ashes system is quite balanced in my opinion, as it doesn't make the game too easy but can even make the game harder since bosses tend to switch targets for their attacks mid-combo, which makes it harder to read them. Now that we've been introduced to FP, it's only fitting that we got into Elden Ring's magic system. Magic is pretty straightforward in this game. Spells cost FP, FP is increased by leveling your mind stat, is restored by drinking the Flash of Cerulean Tears, and most spells scale with your intelligence stat. Intelligence isn't the only spellcasting stat there is though. For you holy bros out there, some spells called incantations will usually have faith as their scaling stat and usually deal with light, lightning, fire, and their variants. While you can find tons of videos online of magic builds slapping endgame bosses left to right, it's still pretty balanced in my opinion since it leaves you pretty squishy and it takes time to cast your spells. Magic combat in the game is quite fluid and enjoyable, even for one like myself who always just likes to run strength builds every playthrough. Now while we're here, I'll also throw in ranged combat with the use of bows and the likes. While there are some builds out there that mainly use bows as the main weapon, I haven't tried to finish the game using one from start to finish. Like magic, using ranged weapons feels pretty polished, and there are even Ashes of War that you can only use with bows that are actually quite good. If you're playing this game for the first time though, I wouldn't recommend going with a full bow build right from the get-go. There are a ton of usable items in Elden Ring. Some are throwables that you have to craft and will deal damage of various types depending on what you craft. Others give buffs or cure debuffs, are materials that you use for upgrading, and so on. Items aren't a huge deal in my opinion if you're not looking to min-max stats for your build during boss fights, but there are definitely some items that you want to hoard just in case you need them. Last but not the least, when it comes to controls and combat, there's the carry weight. Unlike other RPGs, the carry weight only takes into account the items that you have equipped rather than the total weight of your items in your inventory. Why does this matter? Because your carry weight will decide whether or not you will have a light roll, a medium roll, or a fat roll. The heavier you are, the more sluggish your dodge roll becomes, making it harder to time proper dodges. In my experience, the best roll is the medium roll since it gives me the comfort of wearing enough armor to tank a few hits, and a good enough dodge roll to actually avoid getting hit. Now let's focus on how to actually get stronger. There are a few ways in how to do this, and we'll start with the most straightforward one, leveling up. You level up by spending runes while resting in Sites of Grace. You don't get the chance to level up right from the get-go though. You'll need to have completed a cutscene where you meet with Melina, who will then grant you access to the level up feature when resting in Sites of Grace. I'm not exactly sure when this happens in the game, but I do know that it happens very early on. When defeating enemies, you gain runes. You can see how many runes you've accumulated on the bottom right of your screen, and there's basically no limit to how many runes you can hold. Each level will allow you to increase any stat of your choosing by 1. From there, the required number of runes needed to level up increases. Pretty straightforward, huh? Well, I'm sure you've heard of it, but whenever you die in the game, you drop all the runes you were carrying where you died. You'll have to return to that place to regain those runes, but if you die again before reaching them, you lose them forever. Back when Souls games weren't open world yet, this was much more devastating since there wasn't much to explore if you got stuck in an area. You either had to suck it up and farm repeatedly in the same area to gain more levels, or just plain get good. Here in Elden Ring, the mechanic is much more forgiving. If you find yourself struggling to complete an area, you can just come back to it later and level up at other areas that are within your capabilities. I find this great since it takes a bit away from the game's intimidating vibe and makes it much more inviting for people new to the genre. Another way to get stronger is by upgrading your weapons and spirit ashes. Throughout your adventuring, you'll come across smithing stones and grave gloveworts. These are upgrade materials for your weapons and spirit ashes respectively. While increasing the stat that your weapons and spells scale with will increase your damage, weapon upgrading will always provide a stronger boost to your damage for most of the game. There's plenty of these materials in the game, and you can even get items that allow you to unlock them for purchase in the game's main hub area. I've been talking about weapons and spirit ashes to deal more damage, but what about you magic lovers? You can upgrade your staves and other spellcasting items like you would normal weapons, and that would increase your spell damage slightly. You see, when you upgrade a staff, it doesn't increase spell damage by a flat amount like a sword would for physical damage. What increases is the scaling stat. The higher the scaling of the weapon, the more influence that stat, usually intelligence, faith, or arcane, will have on the spell. Stronger spells require more FP and sometimes longer preparation, but they're well worth it in my opinion. Also, to be able to equip more spells, you'll need memory stones, which are key items that you find that permanently increase the number of spell slots you have by 1. Now that we've all got a few levels and upgraded gear under our belt, how about we go and start doing some quests? When I say it like that, it sounds like you just go up to an NPC and pick up a quest like in any other RPG. That couldn't be further from the truth in this game. In today's version of the game, you can actually see the icons of the NPCs on the map now, but back then, you'd have to remember where they were and guess where they went. I imagine this would turn off a lot of players, and it did back then, especially when some of these quests hide two of the most favorite endings in the game. Some areas and bosses are also accessible only if you follow certain quest lines along with some items, weapons, and spells. If you truly wanted to experience everything Elden Ring has to offer, you'll need to have a knack for exploration and checking every nook and cranny. Just like Elden Ring storytelling, the questing in this game is pretty vague. NPCs will give you objectives to do that are pretty straightforward sometimes, but other times you'll be scratching your head thinking of where to go next. This could get quite frustrating since some of the bigger quests require you to finish parts of other quest lines to progress. Not to mention that if you progress too far into the main storyline, you'll get locked out of some quests. While this part of the game sounds like quite a hassle, it's a little bit of a comfort knowing that you don't really need to complete any of them to beat the game. It's an optional part of the game that rewards you quite nicely if you spend the time to complete them. Now, wouldn't it be nice if there was some kind of central hub where you could visit that had the essential NPCs and some of the ones that you need to talk for the quests? There's actually one in the game. Welcome to the Round Table Hold. I'm not exactly sure when you gain access to this, but I remember I was given access to this place after dying multiple times to Margit in my very first run of the game. Here you'll have access to the NPC that upgrades your weapons, your spirit ashes, grants you miracles, overworld items, and of course, let's not forget
Sir Gideon Othmere, the all-knowing.
You'll find yourself revisiting this place quite frequently after key points in the story and some quest lines. Imagine you're out exploring in the world, minding your own business, and then BAM! Invader comes in. If you plan to play this game online, there's a high probability of this happening to you. Elden Ring's multiplayer consists of a few specific situations: boss fights, invasions, and duels. First, to participate in multiplayer, you have to use certain items. The Tarnished Furled Finger drops down your summon sign for other players to bring you to their world for co-op play. The Festering Bloody Finger allows you to invade other players' worlds, and the Finger Severer acts to send other players or yourself back to their respective worlds. These are the basic multiplayer items, but there are others that have similar effects with small added effects to them. Boss Fight Multiplayer is the co-op part of multiplayer where you'd summon a player to your world, or vice versa, and help each other clear the area and ultimately that area's boss. The summoned player can stay for as long as they want in the available space. Unless they die, the host dies, or the boss of the area is slain. Invasions are kind of the opposite. You're confined to the same area that you would if you were playing co-op, which is still a large area by the way, but now there's someone trying to hunt you you down. The invasion ends if the host dies, the invader dies, or the host enters a fog wall to initiate the area's boss fight. If you're the invader, there will be a ping on the compass that will show the general direction of the host, and if you're the host, you'll have to keep your eyes out for a red silhouette that's out for blood. The last of the three is duels. There are coliseums in the game that allow for duels with matchmaking. There's a coliseum for one-on-one duels, 2-on-2, and 3 versus 3. But I think the most notable of the duel areas are specific areas of the game that the community has deemed to be public duel arenas, or as they called it in Dark Souls 3, fight clubs. In my opinion, this is where you witness the best that the PvP community has to offer, since most players who participate follow the unspoken rules of PvP here. If you ever get into the PvP side of the game, definitely make sure to check out the coliseums and the fight club areas. Unless you want to go at it no holds barred, then go invade your heart's content. The bosses in the game are easily my favorite bosses in all the Souls series. The game forces you to learn when to be patient and aggressive, since bosses will usually switch up their combos and even the timing of their attacks. Back then, bosses would mostly have a certain rhythm or pattern to their combos. In Elden Ring, these patterns are less predictable, which make for a much more interesting and challenging fight. The cutscenes before the bosses get you hyped up, the dialogue while fighting them gives you anime level chills while trying to stay alive, and the music the music. The music of the Souls games, when it comes to the bosses, never misses. Those are all subjective though. I still believe that this game does boss fights correctly, as they feel like a perfect test of how you've honed your skills as a player. Sometimes you can just power through bosses by over-leveling yourself, but other times you'll find yourself actually learning with every failed attempt, slowly but surely acquiring the skills and knowledge needed to beat the boss. These wins give you the best feeling, since they actually have a sense of accomplishment. You didn't win because you raised your stats, you won because you were just better. This was actually the thing that got me hooked into Souls games when I first bought Dark Souls 1 way back then. A good chunk of the bosses are unique encounters, each needing a different approach. Bosses also have phases which are triggered depending on the amount of health they have left. These phases give additional challenges to the fight, which should prompt you to try and finish the fight sooner rather than later. The speed of the combat in Elden Ring doesn't make things any easier either, since you'll be faced with a lot of bosses that can easily zip through the battlefield in quick fashion. Being an open world does present its problems here with the bosses though, since to be able to fill this massive world with tons of minor dungeons, bosses will have to be repeated. It's not too bad since you still get unique rewards and the fight isn't repeated as a carbon copy, but I can see how it can get tiring to fight your way through a dungeon in the third area of the game only to realize that the boss is a buffed up version of a boss that you met in the first area. Now that was a lot to talk about. Let's get a move on and check out where this game stands in terms of replay value. I played Elden Ring first on the PS4 and it took me around the 100-hour mark to beat the game. I took my sweet time exploring what the lands between had to offer, and I soon realized that there was much more to discover even after beating the game. Luckily, NG Plus is a thing with From Software's games. New Game Plus is a game mode where you repeat the game with all your levels and most of your items from your previous run. Mobs are now stronger and give more runes. Unfortunately, there's not much else that's new, unlike in Dark Souls 2 where there are new enemies and new enemy placements. At least now you can focus on getting a different ending and or respec into a new playstyle. Diversity of each run will mainly stem from your build, since there's really only one direction the story mainly goes and not much choice with how to progress the game. I can see how New Game Plus wouldn't be appealing to some people since it might just get tedious to explore again at that point, but for those who want to try their hand at more challenging fights, the option exists. To give a short recap of the pros and cons, the pros are: the gameplay is smooth and feels great, exploration is well rewarded, progression is easy and noticeable, bosses feel great to fight and give a sense of accomplishment, tons of builds to make, character is highly customizable with unique weapons and armor pieces, and the world just looks damn good. The cons would be not much to offer in terms of storytelling, quest lines may be challenging to progress without a guide, while there are multiple endings, most of them can only be accomplished by doing the side quests, which again can be hard to do. New Game Plus gives you another go at the game, but doesn't offer much more than that, and most minor bosses are just repeats of other mobs and or bosses. With all that's been said, I believe Elden Ring is actually the easiest point of entry for someone who wants to get started with the Souls genre of games. I've got my money's worth out of it, and I'm definitely going to come back to it once the DLC comes out. So is Elden Ring the right game for you? That's not actually for me to say. Just remember, all of this is coming from a lover of Souls games though, so make sure to mull over the cons I mentioned earlier to see if this would be a good fit. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I really appreciate the support since it takes quite a bit of time and lots of effort to make these videos from scratch. If you guys liked the video, do give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more of my upcoming reviews you don't want to miss. If you want to ask anything about the video or share something about the game, feel free to put it in the comments below. Stay safe out there and have a great day ahead.